What is up, YouTube people? Eric here with Team Badman. Welcome you guys back to another edition of Bad Builds, where we take a look at some of the decks and ideas we've been working on here to give you guys an idea of, what we've been working on, some of the ideas behind how we build our decks, and maybe give you guys some ideas for decks as well. And I think today's is actually exceptionally well timed. I was actually going to save this video for later on in the week, but given that the New Hampshire Regional just finished up yesterday, and this deck is kind of focused around where a lot of those top cutting decks really had their strengths at, I think it's a really good time to release this build for you guys. So as we've kind of been noticing throughout this OP season, there's a lot about very, very aggressive decks. Originally it started with lots of the physically aggressive ones. Brawley made a lot of claim early on in the game. Cooler was kind of around as well to help get around a lot of that damage, rejuvenate it off while still dealing out a very considerable amount of damage at the same time. And of course we had 13, who, even though a lot of his builds were very, very anger oriented, he could also deal a very considerable amount of damage, especially once he got to level 3. Well, as we've made our way through OP season and some of these decks have kind of waned and fallen off, other ones have come in to replace them. While 13 is still very prominent, you don't just have a lot of the Red Enraged builds anymore. Of course, you've got Blue Tag Team and Black Devious, and a lot of these are centered around utilizing the 14 and 15 allies, especially to catapult up to that very clutch level 3 and start dealing out some serious punishment from there. But another deck that's come around is Namekian Restored Gohan, which gained a major push after the new Vengeance level 1 for Gohan came out, which allowed him to search out some of those allies and jump very quickly to his level 2, which provides a +2 life card buff to all styled attacks. Now, as we know, Ally Gohan has been actually kind of a focus for the Namekian in particular, where a lot of cards from the Heroes and Villains set were very specifically catered around him, made to be a strong thing, and it's made a very, very powerful showing with Gohan placing very, very high in the past several regionals and winning out at the New Hampshire Regional yesterday. So major congratulations to both Thomas Delina and TJ Corcoran, playing Gohan and 13 respectively, for earning your guys' invites. Very, very well earned. But that's actually the focus of the deck we're going to present here today, is anti-ally, but at the same time still keeping a very aggressive bend, still trying to be very up there with the physically aggressive metagame and dealing out a very considerable amount of damage while providing hate to a lot of those decks that are going to try to utilize allies to their benefit. And I figure what better MP to do it with than the MP who's almost specifically designed for it, Android 17. We're going to take a look at Red Ruthless Android 17 today, and let's just go ahead and get right into it. So Ruthless 17, as should be expected, is a very physically aggressive deck. There's a lot of physical damage in here, a lot of tech to prolong combat and pull out some of those extra attacks. And at the same time, you also have a lot of critical damage effects in there, a lot of means to kind of get those allies out of the way. And it's also nice tech against some of the ball decks that are out there. Gohan is a really good example in Namekian Restored, to where he can actually run the Dragon Balls as well, so he's got an extra win condition. This is also useful against the ever-popular Cooler decks, against Roshi decks if they come back. There is a little bit of way to deal with everything. While it does have its drawbacks, there are a lot of strengths that it can work with, and I tried building the deck a lot around that, being able to utilize 17's native strengths. So I'm going to start off with the setups, which of course if you're talking about a 17 deck, you basically have to run the van. It's his major asset. In this case we're running a full set, 3 copies of Android 17's van, which is a little bit excessive, it might seem, especially with the decks that don't necessarily run allies. It may feel like a dead card. At the same time, 17's early powers all utilize the van in some way or another. Pull it out of the life deck, pull out of the discard or the banish zone, or if it's in play on his level 3, damage is unpreventable from his attack. So you want to be able to utilize that frequently. Now I will admit there are no allies in this deck, but there are allies that can be recommended as well. Android 16 is a really strong ally right now, being able to wick off some life card damage, a pseudo hiding drill so to speak. Android 20 is still strong because you can deal a lot of unpreventable damage there. Of course, there's plenty of options that you can run. This one doesn't run any, and that's just a personal tech option right there. And also in here, there are 3 copies of everyone's favorite red setup, Red Relaxation. It's extra stage gain. It's another critical damage effect, so you can get rid of allies if you need to. Plus, you get to draw an extra card, make combat just a little bit stronger on your end, kind of pressure your opponent a little bit, especially if you time some of the discards right. Maybe you've got double strike in the bottom. Maybe you've got a good block for something they pulled with Visiting the Past that they top decked with Ball 7 or Pulverize or whatever it might be. Red Relaxation is it's a fantastic card for the style, and there's no real reason to not run 3 of it here. So on to the events after this. It's relatively light on events, but there's enough that's some relatively effective tech right now. We start off with 2 copies of Stare Down. Hand Disruption is a really big deal, and I feel in this deck, because you want to be aggressive, you want to pressure it, there's more benefit to having this over, say, a Villainous Energy Sphere, because that's more of a reactive kind of card. You wait for them to do something and you respond to it. In this case, Stare Down lets you be a little bit more proactive. It lets you immediately get some of their blocks, some of their heavy pressuring attacks out of the way, so that way you can just clean the road and run them over with the van and your fists, because that's pretty much what this deck is going to do. Next is 2 copies of Unleashed, of course everyone's favorite tech card in the game. Red has a fantastic set of attached cards that you can utilize, which you'll see some of them in this deck naturally. And being able to escalate off some of those early levels without specifically having to rely on your anger can work out really well if you want to pressure opponents heavily in the mid game. It's also a really strong late game closer, especially against decks that purposely shut off MPPV such as Gohan and Brawly. Next up is 2 copies of Tug of War. Tug of War is just fantastic tech right now. You got extra endurance on it. It's another way to banish out an ally. If you draw it into your hand, it's 2 anger, hate, shuffles right back into the deck. So it's got multiple different purposes to it. It's not styled, which bites a little bit because you can't really use it with the mastery. And sometimes you may not even want to draw into it, but it is a card that replaces itself. It's extra endurance in a style that doesn't necessarily have endurance on a lot of its key cards. So it helps out fantastically and fits really well with the theme. Definitely a recommendation here. Next is 1 copy of Red Inferno, which is one of the attached cards we mentioned before. Of course, Ruthless is about revealing that card from your hand, putting it on the bottom of your life deck, and reusing some of your attacks. In this case, you get another critical damage effect off of it, so it is additional hate. It's searchable with Unleashed. It's effective at most any point in the game. Of course, critical damage effects, while they may not be as plentiful in this style as they would be in Enraged with some of the tech that you would run, this helps leverage that relatively easily, and you can just keep a constant stream of critical damage effects on your opponent. It's very useful. It's a solid attached card. And lastly, we've got Time's a Warrior's Tool. Self-explanatory. It's your ideal block. That's about it. So next up, we've got a very light lineup of energy combat cards because they've got excellent extra tech to them. They're just solid attacks all around. So in this deck, there are 3 copies of Red Energy Blast. While it may not be a Blue Betrayal or an Orange Stare Down because you can't banish setup or anything, it's the additional ally hate. You can get rid of drills that may be in your way, which, black runs smooth in this drill, red might run forward stance drill, Namekian can run Namekian assistance drill. So there are a lot of cards to get rid of there. Being able to snipe off allies, especially if they get pulled out early by something like Sobering Hammer or Android 13's level 1 power or Tag Team Mastery. That's really effective to help it get around that. 4 life cards isn't too bad. It's extra anger for you. It works out pretty well. And the other energy attack is 3 copies of Red Static Shot, which is arguably Red's best energy attack. There's a lot of styled physical attacks in this deck, so being able to shut off any endurance from your opponent just by using this card turns just about any aggressive red deck into a pseudo Brawly in a sense. It gives them that level 4 effects, that way if you just punish them, they don't necessarily have any physical blocks, or if you reuse Double Strike or Shattering Leap a bunch of times, you're going to be dealing the full amount of damage to them, which not only contributes to extra critical damage effects, but it's just a massive amount of damage that you can help roll on without having to rely on a card like Android 20 or I'll Dig Your Grave. Of course, it's 2 anger if it hits. It's a guaranteed crit if it hits as well, unless there are any modifiers on the board. In the worst case, you can always pitch it to the mastery and just reuse another attack that's in your discard pile. So it's completely usable, and it's an energy attack that most any red deck should be running, whether physical or not. In this original deck, I had only 3 energy blocks in here, which were 3 copies of Red Energy Shield. Of course, you want to keep your stages high in this case. And Red Energy Shield catapults you up to full in the same way as Black Power Up would. But as a lot of energy decks have started coming back with Yamcha and with Gohan, and even some cooler variants use a little bit more energy attacks than expected, I felt bumping up the energy block count a little bit would help out to kind of even out the play in this game, especially with a lot of the ally decks. So I've included in here an extra 3 copies of Red Energy Defensive Stance. Of course, 2 extra endurance, raise your anger 1 if it blocks. It's a pretty solid block for red. Of course, you can change it to taste if you're trying out this deck, but I know it's worked for me so far, and it would hopefully work for you guys as well. And now we're on to the meat and potatoes of the deck, which is going to be, of course, all your physical combat cards. And there are quite a few in here with varying different tech, varying different power. The whole point is to keep pressure on your opponent in one way or another. Of course, we start off with 3 copies of Red Double Strike. This includes just about any red deck that's out there. 2 free attacks. With your mastery, it's AT plus 2. It's 2 anger off it. It doesn't banish itself after use, so you can always reuse it with the mastery again. Just keep a lot of attacks going towards your opponent. It's just good, especially when you consider that Android 17 actually has a reasonably high attack table count. Prior to the release of Cell and Brawly and whatnot, he actually did have the highest power level in the game, barring Golden Frieza and Super Saiyan God Goku. So it was super useful to have on level 4. He does hit that F bracket pretty consistently. He can deal a decent amount of damage, especially if you throw in something like Red Static Shot to where you can't prevent the damage. Something that doesn't seem too strong can actually deal a lot of damage, and it's just logical tech. Next is 3 copies of Red Heal Kick, which in Enraged, it was alright, I guess, for Enraged. A lot of times you'd want to MPPV, so lowering that anger just to get a card back wasn't necessarily the best, unless, of course, you had the shoulder grab effect in play. But in Ruthless, it's a lot better because you can get back a lot of these physical combat cards that are in here. You don't necessarily need your anger to level with cards like Unleashed in the deck, so you can use your anger as a resource and get back a lot of these strong physical attacks, which the next one would be a really good example to get back with it. 3 copies of Red Power Lift. This is a card that got another new lease on life with Ruthless. Being able to stop a physical attack immediately. It means you can run a little bit lighter on some of your physical blocks. Still deals a decent amount of damage. It does have extra endurance on it, which is something that a lot of red physicals don't have, at least the useful ones. So that's really nice there. Next is 3 copies of Red Collision, which is a very useful physical for this style. You get to search out a card on hit and place it on top of your discard pile, so that way you can utilize it with the mastery later. 2 endurance, it gives you anger. It's got respectable damage to it. If you play it out of the discard pile, you gain the extra anger from it, or if you banish it from the discard pile instead. Well, there's absolutely no complaints about this. It's a very solid physical. It does banish itself after use, so it doesn't get in the way of its own hit effect. No complaints here. Next is 3 copies of Red Sword Stab, which is a fairly vanilla card in a lot of respects. Just raise your anger 1. Does have 3 endurance though, which is really nice. AT plus 4 makes it one of the strongest attacks in the style. It's one that doesn't banish after use, so you can continue to recycle it if you need to. You can deal a lot of damage with this card actually, especially after you leave level 1. You can swing forward easily for 8, 10, 11 stages, whatever it might be, and that can really shut down unprepared opponents relatively quickly. Plus, it gives you the extra anger that you can recycle with your heal kicks, or maybe you just want to use it to level. It's just not a bad choice. There probably could be better ones, but I think it's got enough value in Ruthless to actually make it a worthwhile choice. Next up is 3 copies of Red Tandem Attack. Red Tandem Attack has a lot of useful tech right now with a lot of the decks like to just continually draw cards or place extra cards in their hand, or might utilize something to keep extra cards in their hand, like Namekian Assistance Drill or Black Smoothness Drill. So being able to draw an extra card if you get the tech off is super useful. It is extra anger, it is more endurance off physical, which is again nice. Worst case, even if you don't get off, it's still a physical for AT plus 3, that's AT plus 5 with your mastery, so you can deal a relatively considerable amount of damage with it. It's useful in a lot of situations, and I've seen it use the draw effect many times, even in the same combat. So being able to prolong that is something you want to do with these heavily physical decks, especially as decks continually find a way to draw into extra cards. You've got Draw Coup, and you've got the Blue Resolute Mastery, and I'm sure there will be other masteries that allow you to draw into more cards. So this is going to be very useful in there. For our last styled physical attack, at least a 3 of, is 3 copies of Red Knee Lift. Of course, an immediate critical damage effect. If it hits, you can lower your anger to use another critical damage effect, so that's another case that A3R. It only deals AT stages, which really bites, but you're not necessarily using it for the damage here, you're using it for that extra immediate critical tech. Crit on command is one thing that you like to do in red style, and this card is going to help you do it very easily. In the later game, it can actually deal a decent amount of damage once you get to level 3 and level 4. But if it does, that's just extra icing on the cake for this card. Next up for our last 3 of a physical attack is 3 copies of Pulverize, which doesn't see a whole lot of play anymore. It's one of those cards that everyone's like, yeah, this looks great, I can totally use this, and then just no one really wound up using it. I've seen it in a few decks since OP season has started, but not a whole lot. And in this case, actually extremely useful since the bulk of your deck is attack cards, so you can stack whatever tech you might need, whatever time into your hand. Maybe your opponent's got a bunch of Dragon Balls on the field. Maybe he has a bunch of allies and you need to clear them out quickly. You could stack that Knee Lift or whatever it might be. If you just want to deal out a whole bunch of damage, you can get a Collision, you can get a Sword Stab. There's a lot of useful tech with this. It deals decent damage too. It's another AT plus 3 attack, which there's a lot of these in this deck. So you can put on a lot of pressure with it. In your specific case, depending on tweaks you make, it might overperform, might underperform. But it's useful nonetheless, and if you haven't tried Pulverize recently, I actually recommend trying it. It's pretty good right now. Next up is 2 copies of Red Stomach Dive, which is yet another attached card for the uses of Unleashed. It's another AT plus 4 physical, which is strong. It's another way to use A3R, so that way you can lower your anger and you can throw for some extra damage. If you have both these attached, lower 2 anger, you're dealing plus 4 extra life cards per attack. If you throw in the static shot modifier, so that way they can't use endurance, you've got a ton of damage that is going to be rolling through here. It's completely usable attached card. And lastly is 2 copies of everyone's favorite Ruthless Physical, Red Shattering Leap. Of course, it does cost stages, and since you only have just Android 17 to base off of, it may not actually be useful at some points because you may not necessarily have the stages if you drew into bomb physical block hand and they're dealing a lot of damage to you. But of course, it's still immensely powerful. AT plus 6 with the Mastery is no joke. If it hits, it stays in play to be used the second time, so you can deal just a ton of damage with this. And it's the whole reason it's in the deck. And lastly, we have our physical blocks. 3 copies of Red Resourceful Block, which is still a very usable block, especially considering that Android 17 has actions on his level 1, 2, and 3. So this can be super effective in the mid to late game, to where you can use one of your MP powers, and then lower yourself down a level by blocking with it, and then just continue the onslaught with some extra attacks. It's also an extra means to pull out the van, so if your opponent keeps finding a way to tech back their allies, especially if it's a Ginyu or a Gohan deck, you've got a quick response available to you right there. 3 endurance is certainly usable, especially in a style where a lot of the key cards don't necessarily have a lot of endurance on them, so that's extra tech. And while it may be a little bit risky to actually use this card if your opponent plays a card like Android Armbreaker or something like that, there's not quite as much risk of that right now, I feel, compared to a lot of other just harder hitting cards. So, you know, it's still perfectly usable. Lots of pressure that you can apply with it. It's, you know, definitely a usable option. If you are worried about that, I can also recommend Red Blocking Hand as a 3 of here. If you're worried especially about, you know, gaining extra stages or gaining some of the extra anger, Blocking Hand is still a fantastic block, and it's one I honestly consider in here. I did have it in here for a while before I teched in the red energy defensive stances. So if your local is a little bit more physically oriented, you can definitely go with that. But either way, it's going to work out pretty well. And lastly is 3 copies of Red Duck, which became a little bit more popular of a block after Red Enrage Cooler became sort of a big thing. You know, 2 endurance is very usable, but the real reason that you want to use this block is because it gives red one thing it doesn't have a lot of, and that's discard pile recursion. It allows you to rejuvenate cards from your discard pile equal to the amount of anger you've got when you block with it. So, you know, that gives it a maximum of 4 rejuvenation after Awakening comes out, a maximum of 5 at the moment if you're playing against a blue protective deck and you manage to just kind of plan it all right. It's a really, really big deal for red, and in a way you can also use it to pseudo set up your discard pile for mastery utilization, though it's really hard to do. You know, if you do time everything right with your anger, you know, you can rejuvenate off some of those cards, maybe set yourself up in a really good spot with Red Shattering Leap or a Red Heel Kick or Red Collision or whatever it might be. So there are plenty of ways to set it up with this card, but the rejuvenation is the really, really big factor here. So that is going to do it for this deck. It's actually a lot of fun to play. 17 I think is a little bit underrated of an MP right now, especially with allies coming back into vogue. He can still deal a very considerable amount of damage with a lot of his attacks. He can tech in allies just as well, which are ones that he can, you know, pull out with the van and utilize there. And, you know, I think he'll come back, I think he'll gain a little bit of traction and come back a little bit, especially if the 13s and Gohans and the Ginyus of the world continue to show themselves again and bring back energy beats in a sense. So this deck is meant to, you know, play with that a little while still having answers to some other major threats in the game. You know, it can deal the physical beats that, you know, a lot of other decks can. Maybe not as effectively as, say, Brawly, but you can still deal a very considerable amount of damage with Android 17. You can play the anger-hate game between the mastering, between cards like Tug of War, the critical damage effects. You can mess with opponents who might utilize Dragon Balls, as long as you do so carefully and don't end up, you know, doing this whole big Dragon Ball trade thing to where everyone just gains a bunch of benefit and ends up biting you in the end. But there's plenty of tech in here to deal with a lot of stuff. It's definitely enjoyable. If you haven't tried out 17 or the Ruthless Mastery at just about any point, I definitely recommend it. There's a reason that they came packaged together in the original Evolution starter decks, and it's something that I can recommend trying here as well. So that's going to do it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to click that like button down below. I would love to see your guys' thumbs. If not, click the dislike button down below and let me know what you guys didn't like, so that way I can change it for future videos, fix it up. I'm always looking to improve this and make it better, so please be sure to let me know. Also, if you guys haven't hit that subscribe button down below, please be sure to do so, so that way you can follow this series and all of our other series. While OP season may be coming to a relatively quick close, of course we do have Worlds that'll be coming very, very soon here. And Awakening comes out next month, so you know, there's going to be a lot of detail for that on the channel here, lots of new decks, lots of new ideas. We've also got some other really cool series coming up here very soon, which I'm very excited about, so be sure to check all of those out when they come around as well. And lastly, if you haven't found us on social media, all of our social media links are down below too. So you guys can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, and Libsyn, which is podcast hosting. So we are going to have a podcast up for you guys very, very soon here. It's something I'm really, really excited about. You guys will be sure to hear all about it. So be sure to check all of those out. So that's going to do it for this video. Again, I'm Eric with Team Badman signing out. So thank you guys for watching. And like always, stay bad. We'll see you guys next time. Catch you later.